And I want to welcome you to Interfaith Paths to Peace. This is our Enneagram Community of Practice that meets every Friday at 3 o'clock. It's a great way to start your weekend. So those of you that are joining us on Facebook, we want to welcome you. We've got an exciting program. We are going through and looking at the different triads. And so last week we looked at the heart triad, the 2, the 3, and the 4. And today we're going to do a deep dive into the 5, 6, and 7. And I've got some panelists that are going to be on. I want to welcome Ken Shuck and Colin Pritchard, who's coming to us all the way from New York. We had to go to New York to get another 7. Colin is also another Presbyterian pastor. So that's exciting. The Presbyterians are showing up today on the Enneagram calls. And Ken, actually, and also Fran's going to be our number 6. So Fran, thank you for jumping in last minute and sharing about yourself. And then Ken Shuck. Ken is a seminary student at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, and he's going to be joining us as a 5. And he's also a Presbyterian. So, man, the Presbyterians are all over the Head Triad. You know, that's kind of interesting, right? Because I would say as a denomination, we are a heady denomination, right? So if you're interested in a spiritual community and you're in the Head Triad, check out Presbyterians. They may be a good place for you to go. Colin, we'll let you do a little evangelizing for the Presbyterians on the call when you share. So thank you all so much for being on. Again, we'll have time after the panelists speak for us to ask questions to them. So be thinking about questions. If you know or love somebody that's in the Head Triad, this is a great opportunity for you to try to get into their head without actually getting into their head, right? So you can just transfer your knowledge to your relationship with them. All right, well, let's jump in. I do have a screen share around our Enneagram, so I will I'm gonna make sure I mute everybody here at the beginning. If you all can mute yourself as we're starting, that would be great. So I do want to give a little introduction for those of you that may be joining us. It looks like we've got a couple of new people that are joining us. And I do want to give a little introduction to the Enneagram and what the Enneagram is all about before we jump into the Head Triad specifically. So one of the things that the Enneagram does is it begins to define what we would call the outer layer of our personality. And here's a diagram that was created by Eli Jackson Bear, who's wrote a book on the Enneagram. And what we're looking at is kind of this outer share of personality. There are a variety of theories about how personality is shaped. Some people wonder if you come into the world kind of with a predisposition towards a certain number. Other people really say it's an early childhood environment, that your Enneagram number got formed as a child as you were trying to cope with and thrive in your early childhood situation. I really like that idea. And so a lot of times in Enneagram, we go back to try to ask, and we'll ask our panelists to reflect on the early childhood environment that they experienced that may have given rise to their personality trait. So it begins to describe what we would call the outer layer of your personality. And there are other layers, as this diagram shows. There's a personality, there's a deeper layer of character, and then there's a deeper soul and essence. And so we want to use the Enneagram to describe this outer layer of personality, kind of where we have cultivated that. And so the personality, as Jackson Eli Bear understands it, is made up of patterns of either conditioned or genetic predispositions which encounter the environmental and social circumstances. The personality involves 3 main bodies of manifestation: the physical, emotional, and mental. My story in which I identify myself is made up from my behaviors, my feelings, and my thoughts. So a lot of this that we're looking at is kind of your story, but we don't want to use the Enneagram to just stop there. And in some ways, Jackson Eli Baer describes it well. He says that your true being is deeper than your Enneagram number. He says in our time, the Enneagram has appeared as an illusory medicine to cure an illusory disease. The disease is the egoic idea of separation. The cure is to look in the wisdom mirror of the Enneagram to see past all false identifications to the truth of being. And so we don't want to get stuck in identifying ourselves ultimately with our ego or our Enneagram number, because deeper than that, there is this true self that's beyond our egoic construction. So I always like to remind us about that when we do Enneagram work. You're not just your Enneagram. You're a deeper self that is deeply connected to the source of life and being. And your Enneagram is just an outer shell of that. And so in many ways, we can be healthier when we tap into our true self, which is beyond our egoic self, or our true nature, which is deeply connected to life and to God. So I just like to state that as we get going, as we talk about Enneagram. I do want to help us understand Enneagram practice within what I would call integral practice. And so when we look at Enneagram work, I definitely want us to know that it's doing a particular thing, and it's focusing on a particular area of who we are as human beings. But we want to cultivate other practices. And so one of the ways I like to talk about this is the three realms of consciousness. The first would be the upper realm of consciousness. And those are things like transpersonal states of awareness, non-duality, pure awareness. A lot of our mystical practices help us cultivate this area of ourself. And the practices that we use for those are things like meditation, prayer, contemplation, some forms of yoga. These cultivate what I would call the upper world practices of consciousness and cultivating consciousness. But there's also another realm, which I often refer to as the lower realm of consciousness. And this is a different set of practices. This is dealing with the unconscious. So it's going into pre-personal instead of transpersonal states of consciousness. And this is a lot of what we would call unconscious work. Doing work with those things that we're not conscious of, those elements that we've repressed ourselves. This is a picture of Dante's Inferno, where he's about to go into the deep, dark cave of the unconscious. And there are certain practices that are really important here. This is where dream work and active imagination, a lot of forms of psychotherapy help us move that which is unconscious or repressed into consciousness. So those are two forms of practice. The one the Enneagram is really working on, I think the best, is what we would call the middle world. The middle world is where we both basically have waking states of consciousness. These are the personal and interpersonal realms of the ego. They are working with that which we are conscious of in order to have more healthy and effective relationships, to work in our jobs, to work in community. And the Enneagram really does do a good job here. It's wanting to help you understand and work with the ways in which your personality shows up in the world, and to become more aware of that, to have more, to be healthier in its expression. And so the Enneagram is a good example of what we would call middle world practices, including things like therapy, coaching, education, developing skills. So when I talk about the Enneagram, I do hold it in a context of integral practice. And I think integral practice is really important. So be sure you've got a practice in each one of those areas. And the Enneagram is a great practice in the middle world. So as you all know, the Enneagram is made up of these caricatures, 9 different numbers, and we put kind of labels or caricatures to those, which are helpful and also sometimes unhelpful. We're not wanting to box ourselves up to always having to behave this way or always having to perceive this way. But in general, they're true about the ways we end up showing up in the world, and we can caricaturize them in all kind of different ways. Here's some different pictures of numbers, which in some ways are cute and fun and helpful. In some ways, they can be misleading as well. What we're doing in these 3 weeks, last week, this week, and next week, is we're actually looking at the triads. So the Enneagram is broken down to 3 numbers in each of the 3 triads. And they have some different dynamics that they work with. Last week, we looked at the heart triad, which is dealing with emotions, image, and they deal with that or work with those in different ways. But their fixation, that's often what we say, the fixation is in the area of the heart, which is image, emotion. Today, we're going to look at the head triad, and so the fixation is within the thinking center, sometimes even what we would call the doing center. They're all working with their minds in many ways, thoughts in many ways, rational, detailed, future planning oriented, but they do that in different ways. And that's what we're going to be focusing on today. And then next week, we're going to look at the gut triad, which is the 8, the 9, and the 1. And they're all working with what we would call instinctual energy, or often we talk about anger. They work with anger in different ways. So I just wanted to put that in context. Today, we're looking at the head triad, and we'll focus there. So I want us to jump in and start looking at the numbers. We're going to start with the Enneagram 5, which is in the head triad. So as I said earlier, they're all working with thought and anxiety often, and they do that in different ways. So let's jump into the 5, and then we've got Ken on here. And Ken, after I describe this some, I'll allow you to jump in and share what you identify with and don't identify with, and then we'll have some conversation before we move on. The 5 is often called the Investigator, and they are traditionally the most introverted of all the Enneagram types. One of the ways that I like to imagine and describe 5s is that they surround themselves in an igloo of books, or a castle of books. And they have these little windows that they look out onto the world at. But they're surrounded by information, which is kind of a protective space for them. And they are often very rational, intellectual. Sometimes the image of the absent-minded professor come to mind. They often report that their early childhood experiences, that they responded to experiences of anxiety or stress by going inward, and like going into their rooms or into their closet and reading a book. So that information became one of the ways they dealt with anxiety. We can see there at the levels, at some of the top levels, they are really, Einstein was a 5, these really visionary, imaginative, creative people that discovered things and like to investigate with their head. And you can see on the levels where that goes when they get isolated. It really is into a social isolation that they begin to devolve in some ways into. They do have a tendency to be able to go into deep thoughts. Sometimes they can get lost in their minds, and in nihilism for 9s really can become a real dynamic for them that sometimes they work in. Just briefly, a 5 goes to an 8 in integration, and that's when a 5 feels secure enough that they can move outward in a form of extroversion that is often very helpful. They often can be very insightful leaders because they've witnessed and seen what's happening in an organization, and they have a good sense of what all's happening, and they can be really effective leaders at an 8. At a 7, which kind of looks interesting too, because those are both extroverted moves for a 5. A 7, though, is often expressed when the 5 becomes so alienated in relationship that they reach out in extroversion as an anxiety move. And so it feels a little bit odd that a 5 goes to a 7. because they've been isolated, they move out, sometimes in social ways that may come across as odd or not natural for them. And so that's a manifestation of their stress often. So I want to turn it over because, again, the great thing about panels is we actually get to hear people describe themselves rather than share information, which I think is really important. So Ken, introduce yourself a little bit, and then share with us, if you don't mind, a little more about yourself. I'm so thankful for you being on the call today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So my name is Ken. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm entering my second year of seminary at the Louisville Presbyterian Seminary here in Louisville. And I'm an artist. So I think I think first and foremost, I am an artist, and that's huge in how I identify and see myself, and how it informs my sensibilities and how I approach life and relationships. I became introduced to Enneagram, a few years ago. It must be like 5 years now, which is crazy. At first I thought I was a 4 because I'm an artist.
Mm-hmm.
But after some more understanding of Enneagram and understanding how I integrate and disintegrate, I follow patterns that more closely match a 5. So I'm a 5-wing 4. So I'm in a lot of ways very in touch with emotion and in touch with other people's emotion. But when I start to stress, I intellectualize emotion. I don't feel it. I don't feel like how it is in my body in a more ephemeral and ambiguous sense, so much as I think this reminds me of that time that this other thing happened. I put words to it, and my body starts to not feel the emotions. That being said, recently I've been disintegrating into 7, and yes, it is very interesting and also strange and jarring for people who know me, because I had a comment where someone was like, wow, you've been really sassy lately. You've been really this lately. And they're like, you've just been out of character lately. And I'm like, I'm just trying desperately to connect with people. I can't help it. I have to be really intentional. Well, I'm not intentional. I mean, I have a lot of urges to be like, I need to call somebody and talk to them for a long time and just chat with them, which is not in my normal character. So, and then also in how I integrate, I do move more towards that assertive, firm leadership role that people really appreciate, because I bring the sensitivity of an emotionally sensitive introvert that I am. It was there in the graphic it had for the 5, this woman with a spyglass, and she was surrounded by a barbed wire fence. I feel like that's a really good description of how I feel when I'm in a group of people. Like myself in a group dynamic, I always feel like there is 10 feet away. Like I'm 10 feet away from people all the time. I was doing portrait paintings once, and I really love portrait painting because I just have somebody who sits there for several hours, and I get to stand so far away from them while I'm talking to them. And someone pointed it out to me. I'm like, do you think you would like this so much because you get to stand so far away and you get to just observe a person? I'm like, yeah. So I love observing people. Like my ideal superpower I would have would be to be invisible, and I would just be watching everything all the time where I don't have to contribute or do anything. Lurking on the internet. I've been, let me go back to my childhood here. Okay, so I have a very intellectual family and also quirky family in terms of their interests. So all of the men on my father's side are engineers. And my mother has 4 degrees. She has 2 bachelors and 2 masters. Very, family is very encouraging and interested in education. Like that's definitely like the number one priority in that family. Number one value is learning. The way that my mother and I communicate is like, well, did you know this about this kind of ancient sea worm, that it had these sorts of jaws and it never occurred again in evolutionary history? Isn't that crazy? Like, that's just like how we talk. And like, that's how we connect, is through like factual information that we find to be interesting. And so I think that everyone in my immediate family, not my extended family, but at least in my immediate family, has a 5 either as their type or in their wing. Like they follow that personality pattern. So let's see. Let me move forward a little bit. So like last night, for fun, what I did was I went outside and I just observed fireflies, but not just for the sake of observing fireflies, but to watch their flight patterns to determine what their species were. So like, I think I found 3 species of fireflies last night, and that was pretty cool. I really enjoyed that. But like, that is like what's exciting and exhilarating in my life, is like, oh my gosh, I found 3 species of fireflies and I'm able to identify them because I know what their flight patterns look like. Like that's like what gets me really excited. Or like lately, one of my soothing activities has been studying about ancient time, like deep time. Like I learned yesterday that marsupials evolved in South America, and then at that point, Antarctica and South America and Australia were all connected, and the marsupials traveled from South America through Antarctica, which at that time was like a balmy forest with palms and stuff, and then they moved up into Australia, and then when all these continents separated, like the marsupials were able to able to survive when the placental mammals took over everything else. And I'm like, oh, that's so exciting. Like, see, like that's like me, like my comfort and what makes me happy and excited is learning what to other people might be trivial and strange facts, but for me it's very extremely exciting. Yeah. And but I think that I feel at least very fortunate in that I do have a 4 wing, so I am very well connected with my emotions, and my like I guess more like quirky like individuality. I have a very strong sense of who I am, and that's really really helpful. But in a lot of ways, I would say that this period of isolation has been a lot less hard for me than other people, because 6 feet away isn't too bad when really what I want all the time is 10 feet from people. So, you know, it's not too bad. But yeah, so I hope that gives you an idea of what my experience as a 5 is.
That is great. You did such a good job of being a 5 in front of us. So that was beautiful. So let's, what's really fun here is just let's have some questions. Do you all have thoughts, questions that you want to ask Ken? This is a good chance for us to have dialogue for a few minutes. So unmute yourself and let's dive in a little more to the 5. There looked like there was another person that identified as a 5. Maybe Laura may some, if you want to share how you may or may not identify. So somebody jump in with a question. Yeah, Linda, go ahead.
I don't know if this is answerable, Ken, but can you say what it is about being around other people or with other people that makes you anxious or drains you? Is it the introversion or what? Because I understand that.
Well, so that's also interesting, is that I am, compared to the rest of my family, the most extroverted one. Like, so and people like who meet me, who I'm in a new environment, I don't know anybody, they're like, oh, of course you're an introvert. But when I'm comfortable and I go more into that 8 integration, people might confuse me for an extrovert, but it's not. Like, it's just more that like I feel like I own the space. So things that I do is like, if I'm in a classroom, which we won't have physical classrooms this year, this coming fall.
Oops.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. Okay. So I'm disappointed that we won't have a physical classroom because it's a lot easier to learn in that environment. But like things that I do is like I come to the classroom like 15 to 20 minutes early so that I feel like this is my space and all of you people are coming into my space. Or I'll sit in the very front of the row because then that way I won't see the backs of people's heads and feel drained by like all the presence of other people in the room. But I would say that one of the things that bothers me is expectations and feeling like the potential to be misunderstood or misread, because a lot of the time my humor is very dry. I say things that seem really random, but they're not random because they definitely are relevant to the conversation. If you just would follow my line of thinking already, come on, catch up, you know, like, I mean, but it's just like, I'm like, I don't want to feel like I have to explain myself. Like, I just want you to understand me and I don't have to like do this for you. I'm already thinking too much anyway. So yeah, I would say that a lot of it, like some of it's probably like just like a, I guess a physiological response to like being from a very introverted family and not having the conditioning at a young age to be constantly have people all up in my business all the time. But I would say that is a lot in terms of like, if I'm going to intellectualize it, it's a lot of me not wanting to deal with other people's expectations of what normal human behavior should and shouldn't be. Like what normal conversation is. And I'm like, small talk, get that out of my face. I don't want it. No one has time for it, especially me. So like, yeah, hope that answered your question.
One of the characteristics, thanks, Ken. One of the characteristics also that fives often talk about is they don't mind being social, but they like it to have boundaries around it. So they like to know when something starts and when it's going to end. But this kind of party, like, I don't really know when it starts. I don't know when it's going to end. I'm not sure what my role is in it, is very anxiety producing. For fives, or can be. And they like to know that they have a role. Like in organizations, fives often are experts in one area, and that's how they know they fit, is because they hold a lot of information. So they may be somebody that's working in bookkeeping or in an introverted, and they know a lot of things, and people go to them because they're an expert in something. That's often one of the ways they relate and like to be the expert in something. Susan, you unmuted yourself. You have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. Ida, you got your hand raised?
Yes, see, I'm being very good. I actually used that little icon.
You did. You raised your hand.
Yes,
Thank you.
So fascinated by this conversation. I have a gazillion questions, but I want to ask you this. So it's from my understanding, when you go into the integration, you go to an 8 where creation lies and doing lies, and when you disintegrate, it seems like you're going to a 7 where you get to choose really one. Are you going to play the observer role as a 5, or if you are going to be a participator as a 7, and then a creator as an 8? So I don't see the downside of a 5 yet. Can you tell me what the downside or the disintegration, where the discomfort lies for you?
Yeah, so I would say that I'm a very self-controlling person. And when I'm in a 7 place, I don't feel like I have control over myself. I don't feel like I can trust my ability to engage socially. Like I feel like my jokes might go too far. I might seem too abrasive. I might be too biting. And then because like if I get a negative response, like people are like, who is this person that I used to know so well? Now you're suddenly this other person. Like, I don't understand this. Then I feel self-conscious and I don't want to interact with people. So then it drives me further into my isolation, or further into my insecurity of feeling like I'm insane. Like there was like, maybe this is being me being melodramatic, and because I've been learning about existential philosophy recently, but when I said like the nihilistic something, like it had something to do with like one of the upper lower levels of integration, I was like, Oh yeah, that sounds about right. Like, yeah, nothing matters.
Yeah.
Interaction's hard.
All of the kind of the existentialists, they were all, I think, fives, because fives also have this ability to go intellectually into relativity. Like they can actually go to seeing the relativeness and in these really dark kind of, well, I think other people would consider them dark spaces. And fives can go there rationally. Like they can think about nothingness in a way in which they can articulate it, but it also becomes existential for them and can lead to that kind of that complete sense of relativity or nihilism. But they can do that not just with their emotions, but intellectually they can understand like nothingness in some ways, I think. Did that help?
It did help. So what work could fives do to get themselves more in their body and really participating when they fall into that 7 wing?
So I think, honestly, I have a really bad problem with multitasking and trying to get as much done as possible all the time. And trying to just focus on one thing at a time has really helped. Like, I'm just like, nope, I'm not going to look at my phone while I'm on the Zoom call. I'm not going to do this. That being said, I will probably do some multitasking later in the Zoom call. But like, I jog every day. Honestly, I'm really bad about this, but I'm like, oh, I want to go for a walk. Well, I need to find a good podcast to listen to so I can listen to that while I walk, because, the walk isn't enough. Like there needs to be some like emotional and intellectual stimulation happening. And that's annoying, because sometimes you should just be able to take a walk for the sake of taking a walk, but I can't do that very well. So like, trying to like actually sit with your body is something that I am currently working on. And in terms of like getting out of my 7 integration, I just need to feel more secure in my relationships and understand that people will accept me even when I'm being crazy, in my opinion. That helps a lot. So it is helpful to reach out and then actually get those positive reciprocated interactions.
Ken, thanks so much, especially knowing that these kind of things can be a little daunting maybe for fives, but you articulate all of that so well, and really grateful for your presence on the call today. We do have to move on. Oh, we could almost do a whole session on one number. Maybe we'll do that like over in sometime. That would take almost a year, but that would be really cool. So thanks, Ken, so much. We are going to move on, though, to the 6. And so I want to pull up our Prezi again. And moving to the 6. So we're going to see this pattern in the Enneagram of moving outward, ambiguous with, or moving inward with the primary issue. So the primary issue for the Head Triad is anxiety and fear. And so 7s move out with fear, 5s move in with fear, and 6s are the most ambiguous with fear. So they kind of do both. So they're often called the loyalists, and 6s are loyalists because they, to deal with anxiety and stress, they like to create structure. They also like to do that through being committed to friends, being loyal to institutions. They are the institutional builders, because that they find in that structure a lot of security for themselves. And so trust is a challenge for 6s. They often report that in early childhood environments, they didn't feel safe. And so they had to create structures of safety for themselves. And they did that by organizing themselves. They often are what's called the skeptic, so that they think about all the things that could go wrong in order to order themselves so those things won't happen. So they spend a lot of time in anxiety in forethought of what could go wrong. So in many ways, they're great problem solvers because they've spent a lot of their life thinking about potential problems that can happen. And then what do they need to do to make sure that that's not going to happen, that they're going to be safe? There's a lot of kind of anxiety of I'm not going to be safe. So things like the pandemic, right? Those create a lot of anxieties for sixes that are already very anxious. And so they like to order themselves, so they'll make sure that, people that build bunkers and put a lot of food in storage, a lot of times they're sixes, right? Because they're preparing, they're ordering themselves out of their fear and anxiety. So we have two kinds of sixes. We have those that move towards that which they're afraid of, and those that move away from what they're afraid of. So sometimes they can look different. So like a lot of the folks that jump out of planes and do all of these kind of crazy, what we would consider like edge behaviors, a lot of times they're six because they're what's called counter-phobic sixes. So you have phobic sixes and counter-phobic sixes. And sometimes they look different, but they're both working out of stress and anxiety. So as we see at the top levels, they really can be heroes for people. They can be really deeply committed to people and to institutions. They make great friends, can really be wonderful coworkers. But as they begin disintegrating, they get more anxious. And you can see that they move in overreacting dependent, paranoid hysteric, self-defeating masochist, so that their anxiety really begins to take hold and they begin responding in some negative ways. A six that moves towards stress actually moves towards a three, which is a way of kind of putting on masks or feeling like they're not being themselves because they're trying to create security. So that they have a sense of not being authentic in the ways in which threes can wear different masks. Towards integration, they become like nines. They kind of soften and can take a lot of perspectives. If they're not worried about fear or anxiety, they can really open up like nines and they can see a lot of different perspectives. One of the things we know about sixes, they can be what here at the level 6, the authoritarian rebel. If sixes lose trust in a friendship or in an organization, they can take it down. And they feel like this rebelness towards whistleblowers a lot of time are sixes because they've been hurt by authority or an institution that they trusted. And they become they can rebel against that and become very attacking in some way against those authority figures or institutions that hurt them or they didn't feel like trusted them. And again, you can see that's a pulling from often an early childhood sense of not trusting authority figures. So they have to take that on themselves. So let's turn it over. Fran, thanks so much for being on and at the drop of a hat, willing to jump in. So Fran, share a little bit about yourself and then talk some about how you identify as a six.
Well, and I still struggle with six.
That's okay.
But it has been said that the thing you don't want to be is probably what you are. So it's I keep coming. I mean, the parts that I do relate to are the anxiety piece. I mean, I've said for my whole life, anxiety's been my best buddy. But my anxiety is not so much like about the coronavirus. I've really enjoyed being sequestered and finding all kinds of things to do at home. That's not been a problem at all. My anxieties are usually about myself. Am I okay? Am I good enough? Did I hurt somebody's feelings? So that's where we're at. Lots of self-doubt. And I semi-make fun of myself because I go through these cycles, crises of confidence, where I sort of bottom out. And then I usually will come back. It was drummed into me to be responsible, be responsible, be responsible. So I'm a pretty responsible person. And I guess that's the loyalty. But I mean, honestly, I love my sons dearly, but if one of them was really doing something bad, I would not be absolutely loyal. I mean, I would try to talk with them and you know, but I do, when I'm, you know, I am cautious about making friends, but it's kind of like once I let you into my inner sanctum, you're like there forever, whether you want to be or not.
Mm-hmm. In that sense, deeply loyal to friendships.
Mm-hmm.
Are you involved in any kind of certain organizations?
I mean, not very actively. I've worked at the Center for Women and Families for almost 25 years. So there is that. Well, actually, it has been 25 years. But I'm not much of a joiner. I mean, I do participate in things, but I never feel like I'm super core. I mean, professionally, I'm an art therapist. Yes, I do belong to the American Art Therapy Association, but I'm not especially active. Same thing for the Kentucky Art Therapy Association. I pay my dues, but I'm not particularly active.
Do you, how do you identify with the issue of ordering your life? Are there ways in which you order your life as a protective to deal with anxiety?
You know, not consciously, but I usually do find structure in chaos. But I'm also, you know, but I don't know, well, I guess depends on which aspect. You know, I moved into my house, let me think what year this is, about 14 years ago. And the furniture has not been rearranged since. Okay. But I arranged it the way I really liked it in the beginning, and I've felt very little need to change that. So I guess maybe that would be an example.
Yeah, I think so. How about, let's see if there's other folks that have questions or thoughts. I don't know if we have any other. Susan, you put that you might be a 6. Would you feel free to jump in if you'd like to share as well?
Yeah, I am a, here we are, yeah.
Hey, Susan, thank you.
Hi. I'm a 6 through and through, so
Okay.
I know that about myself. Fear is my motivator. And for the coronavirus, what I resonate with you, Fran, is it's not the virus itself, it's the impact on my relationships and in my ability to stay connected and feel as though I belong and that I can stay loyal to them and they'll stay loyal to me. So that's where my anxiety has been around with that. I am a joiner. And once I join a congregation, I'm Jewish. So but when I join a congregation, I stay there. Whether things are going well or not, it depends. But that loyalty is really very, very strong in me. And that means that I will dig in and work as hard as I can to keep, to stay loyal. And so that's a positive point because it helps me to work on relationships. But there are times in previous places I've stayed too long out of loyalty. So.
Good, that's helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Let's have some questions for our 6s. Anybody want to jump in with a question? Yeah, Ken.
Yeah, so this can be answered by any 6, but I'm wondering where does the value lie for the 6? Like, where does your personal value stem from? Like, what ensures your value, like in relationships or like in roles in organizations?
Yes, go ahead, Susan.
For me, the value is in commitment. So it's commitment to God, commitment to ethics, but also commitment to people and to relationships. So that relational commitment is what motivates me the most. It's the central core. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I think that that feeling of being committed and concern that other people may not share that level of commitment or going to be there like you will be there, maybe. Some fear and anxiety around that. Does that ring true? Some, Fran or Susan?
Not for me, but
No.
Rings very true for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Terry, you had your hand up.
Yes, I'm curious. I don't know if this is true of all sixes, so let me preface by saying that. But my experience with a couple of sixes that I have in my close family is that in conversation, for instance, they can say, yes, I agree with this over here, and I agree with that. But when they really get sort of triggered by something, they tend to clamp down on one particular group and have a hard time identifying with other people. So that may not be true for all sixes, but I'm just curious as what we can do to help folks who are sixes to relax a little around their group on a particular, their grasp on a particular group or person. Yeah, just to relax that a little bit so they can maybe free themselves up to even, better options, or to not feel so guilty about not being there for folks who may no longer serve them. I hope that made some sense. But they're very committed to certain people that they even identify as not necessarily being good for them when talking about particulars, but they still have a hard time, like they can't even consider letting those people go because that's their friend and they've always been their friend and they feel obligated to be there.
Yeah, I don't know, Fran and Susan, if you have any response to that or thoughts.
My computer's not behaving very well, so I'm missing some of the information, questions, and discussion. I've moved to a different room. I'm trying to plug it in, maybe do better.
All good.
I can speak to that a bit. That piece of structure and really finding safety and structure. Friendships prove to be structure. So I'm committed to a certain person, even if they may not be as good for me, it still feels safe because it's structure. So that's my gut, that's my reaction to what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm sorry, I was going to say, so there's a sense of, it's not so much about the obligation, although that might be there, but it's the sense of safety that one gets from staying connected to people or groups they've always been connected to.
Right. Yeah, because that, yeah, it just feels safe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Fran, did you want to respond at all to that?
Well, again, I'm missing some of the conversation questions, but I mean, definitely, I have always had a core group of friends, usually not many, 2 or 3, but who I turn to sort things out, for reassurance, to check in with, to assess, my options. And that's always been really important. Yes, 2 of them are on here right now.
Oh, well, that's lovely. Ida, how about you? You got your hand up. You have a question, thought?
Thought, as a 9, when I disintegrate, I go into a 6. And so plugging into that part of who I am, listening to all the 6s, and some great feedback from Terry, by the way. Being in that space of a 6 for me is the anxiety comes up, the lack of control of my environment comes up. And what I feel I need in that space, when I'm in that space as a 6, is knowing what to expect. That's where the structure comes in. That's where the relationship part comes in, where I know this other person and how they respond to me. And once I know what that expectation is, then I can trust that I know what is my role. So as the 6, when I'm in that 6 area and that anxiety comes up, very much about relationships, the loyalty comes into play in terms of my idea of friendship, right? So I'm playing out my idea of who I am in a friendship, regardless of how this other person's been treating me. And I've been in really bad relationships because of that very thing, where it didn't matter what the bad behavior was on the other end, I was following through on my idea of what the relationship or the friendship ought to be. And I think to Terry's point, that's why we get pulled into relationships or environments we know aren't good for us, and yet we stay. And in terms of what you can do is just, I guess it's the trust factor, and clarity is so key, because once a 6 knows what is expected, they can move freely and confidently into another space. Thank you.
Thanks, Ida. Yeah. Any other thoughts or comments? Julie?
Question.
Yeah, please.
I have a 13-year-old son who I am quite certain, and especially after listening to this today, is a 6. So I'm curious to know, if you think back to when you were a early teenager, what would you have liked your parents to have known, or how can I better parent him as a 6? Obviously, provide structure. What else?
Well, one aspect of 6s in my somewhat nominal understanding is there's a tendency to identify the father figure as the safe person and the mother figure as the not safe person. And that was very, very true for me growing up. So I probably can't offer you a lot of good advice from the perspective of a 6, but you know, there's.
Yeah, I think from my experience as well, that there was one parent, it could be a male, it could be the father or the mother, that was not trustworthy, because trust is huge, because the trust and safety are tied to my sense of security. And that's why that's the hitch that gets them to have to feel like they have to create it if it's not there for them. And so they have a lot of anxiety around not feeling safe. And sometimes that can be because an authority figure did not provide enough structure or security for them, that then they psychologically feel like they need to create it for themselves and spend a lot of their psychological energy creating safety and structure. Susan, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, for me as a teenager, my mother was important because she would talk to me about my relationships with my friends. We would talk through the ins and outs of what's happening. I lost a best friend. She was there to share in that. She tended to be an advice giver. She gave a lot of advice, so that wasn't helpful, but I did have a space to actually process the feelings of what it was like. And I do remember her always saying, you know, Susan, your friend is not being nice to you. Why are you putting up with that? And I couldn't let go. That's the 6. But just having a place to be able to process the feelings of relationships was really important.
I mean, I guess one of the things I wish I had was a parent or a parent figure who would encourage and reassure me that I didn't have to be perfect and that I was lovable, and that I'm okay as I am.
Mm-hmm. Are there other thoughts and comments before we move to the 7? Well, Susan and Fran, thank you all so much for just kind of spontaneously being our panelists there. Again, hearing people talk about themselves is so helpful. Instead of just these characteristics, it's actual stories. And so thank you for doing that, and your vulnerability is really helpful in us learning. So I do want to move to the 7s, which I think are the most fascinating number. And exciting number. So yeah, let's turn to the 7s, and I will describe them kind of information wise, and then Colin, I'll invite you to jump in here in a second. So type 7s are called the enthusiasts, other ways of the jack of all trades, master of none, adults with ADHD. 7s really have this kind of integrative minds. So they share that in the thinking triad, but they go out with their anxiety. So like 5s, when they're anxious, go in, right? Sixes are ambiguous. They both go out and in. But sevens go out in the form of what sometimes is called gluttony. Gluttony for experiences, gluttony for feeling alive. They go outside of themselves to get what they get, because they have a sense of, their anxiety often comes from different things. One is feeling like we're going to be trapped in painful situations or painful feelings. My experience, well, here I go sharing mine, but my experience was that I had have this fear of not having enough energy, that there's not going to be enough energy to sustain me. So I create energy by extroversion or planning. If I'm in a situation that I don't like, I often will find myself going into future planning. So we are called the planners. That's one of the things we do in our minds, daydream future events that are going to be exciting and pleasing. And then our calendars often look like that. There's just one thing after the next, after the next. In some ways, not enough time to slow down, because we may be running from painful experience or feeling trapped. And that's the way we manifest it. So at their high levels, they can be ecstatic appreciators, free-spirited optimists, accomplished generalists. But as you can see, as they move down, it's their gluttony that gets them in trouble for experience, hyperactive extroverts, excessive hedonists, and at our lowest level, manic compulsives and panic-stricken hysterics. So we got that going for us. But you can see how their anxiety, like you can see sevens in that they do seem very manic. They can be like fours in that when fours go manic, fours and sevens can look like that. In fact, sometimes sevens really like fours but when they're manic, because they're lots of fun. They're very entertaining, so to speak. And so at lower levels of health, sevens can objectify other people and experiences and consume them like a glutton, that other people become objects of our pleasure or our entertainment, and therefore are objectified in our lower levels of health. Moving towards stress, we move towards 1, and what usually happens there is that a 7 has gotten so chaotic that they have to order themselves. They have to clamp down on themselves. The super ego, the parental ego comes in and just says, all right, no, we're going to order you in order to deal with the kind of the hypermania that can happen. And they can become very critical. When sevens feel stressed, they can be critical of smaller things, a lot like ones can do. Sevens towards integration, this is a really interesting move. The most extroverted moves to the most introverted. A 7 moving to a 5 is a real interesting thing, because all of their extroversion, when they're integrating, they can relax that extroversion because they feel secure. They feel like they've got enough energy, that they're grounded, and then they can look like a 5. And they have the mind of a 5, so they can do a lot of thinking about things. They like theories. They like working in their head a lot. But that as a 5, they can be very grounded in feeling comfortable alone. That's one of the challenges often for 7s, is feeling okay with being alone. Because they have to be alone with themselves. They have to be alone with maybe painful or negative thoughts or feelings. But they can do that at a 5. So, Colin, thanks so much. It is kind of funny that we're both Presbyterian ministers and that we're 7s. Yep. But talk to us some about your experience of being, and you think you're a 7 with an 8 wing, is that right? So maybe you can flesh that out some for us. But introduce yourself some. Thanks, Colin.
Sure. So I'm Colin Pritchard. I'm a Presbyterian pastor here just outside of Rochester, New York. About 20 years into that. October will be 20 years for me. I am musician. I am a chaplain with hospice and with the sheriff's department. So I am a critical response chaplain. So when you see those horrible movies of somebody knocking on the door to make an announcement, that's me. So that's a interesting piece of the life. I'm about 2 weeks away from being installed as the moderator of the Presbytery of Genesee Valley. So that's a sort of administrative role. If you're not familiar with the Presbyterian Church, it's about a 5-county area, and kind of having a chief administrative role in that space. I've been a new church development pastor, and I have coached in the new worshiping communities movement for more than 10 years. So I've been able to coach churches in about six states and work with their pastors and communities there to various levels of success and health, but we get to be a part of that conversation. Married for 23 years to a raging 4, like a raging 4. So the 7 and 4 dynamic is about as entertaining as you can just currently imagine. And have a daughter who is also pretty clearly a 4, and a son who is a little older than yours, Julie, but I've got a solid 15-year-old boy here. So I do all of that stuff, and will be a commissioner to our General Assembly starting in about 3 hours, so that overscheduled thing. I actually chose not to attend the board meeting in order to attend this. And the reason I chose to attend this is because there'd be more people talking instead of having to sit and just vote on things being brought to the board. So this was more fun for my 7-ness. So if you want to see what it looks like, that's what it looks like. My wife actually got me into the Enneagram. It's not surprising that the 4 first went to the deep spaces. She did the Ignatian exercises and went from that into an Enneagram study piece and told me how wonderful it was. And I told her how ridiculous it was. And then once I caught up to her wisdom a few years later, I got connected to this. And I've taken the test in different contexts and different places 2 or 3 times. And I've always landed in just the same space. So the 7 seems to be a very real thing for me. Childhood experiences. Both my parents have been married 3 times each. So early childhood was who am I related to at any given time? Because it did change almost annually for a little while there. I was not especially healthy as an infant physically. And earliest childhood pieces of very, very kind of that manic energy, but not safe. So that sort of hyperactive kid thing, that actually landed me in a primary school that was sort of a special school that focused a lot on socialization, and it was a very hippy-dippy, wonderful, kumbaya, love the earth sort of primary school experience. And that in many ways kind of saved me socially, because I was in a high pressure, wealthy suburb, and all of the energy and chaos of my young life was not going to land there well. And then I went from there into schooling, and there's been a lot of that since. So I resonate big time with the grabbing energy from other people and other things. Especially as a young person, I went into athletics, I went into music, and I went into the security and delight of my dog. And I've been a dog person ever since. One of the great gifts of my teenage years was I was given a dog, and it was, you train her, this is it. She is your task. And that was just saving of a spirit. Right, today is the 9th birthday of my current dog, who is a registered therapy dog. And so my 7-ness loves bringing her into hospice and walking the parks. And we're constantly, it's an entrance into conversation with any random stranger. And so regularly I'll have the dog encountering some nervous child, and now we have an opportunity to connect. And so she's she's my excuse to talk to more people. And gosh, what else can I say? One of the pieces that I find most interesting is, especially in the last few years, that move to integrating as a 5, that space to be quiet and observe has been just this profound gift in my life, and it's only been the last few years. It's actually become part of a sort of a life goal piece I have. One element of that is to really only sing when you are asked to, so that there's all of this energy, all of these ideas, all of this enthusiasm, but if it cannot be heard, then it is wasted or offending. Mm. However, when it is time for it to be heard, it is important and energizing and good. So I sometimes describe it as I've been given the gift in the last few years of being able to shut up. Mm. Not shut down, but stop talking, be present in whatever's really there. And then when there is an invitation and a platform and a space for whatever you're going to say to have some merit and some capacity to be heard, well, then go for it full bore. But until such a time, see what's really real. The other piece, I guess I would say before we open to questions or whatever, is that I have found that the 7 piece is actually an extraordinarily big gift in terms of the crisis response part of my life and ministry. That being in the head center stuff means I can stand in spaces of extreme trauma and not have it overwhelm my gut, right? Not have it be this visceral, physical, I can't be here reactivity, or be so profoundly impactful emotionally that I can't function. I'm not having to absorb all of the extreme emotion, which is of course present and reasonable, but without having to absorb that, I can stand in that space and I will be here with you. I will be here for you. We will acknowledge what is true, but I am not crushed by your trauma. So it can then be a strong ground on which to stand when it's most needed. And that has felt like one of the great gifts of the Head Center. And one of the great gifts of the 7 is we have to go tell somebody that their loved one is gone, or you need to be on site where it is a horrifying loss of life. And you need to be with the officers and keep family away and all that kind of stuff. And the ability to do that compassionately, but also with enough distance emotionally to function well. It's been one of the great gifts for me of being a 7.
Wow, that's beautiful. I really appreciate the naming of the power of being in the headspace that doesn't feel distant, but feels strong, to allow other people to be where they are emotionally. That's a beautiful pastoral kind of image there, Colin. Thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's open it up to some questions. People have thoughts, questions. Tiffany, you also said that you might identify some as a 7, so you could feel free. And Laura, both of you, if y'all want to join in ways that you identify with it as a 7, feel free to do that.
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Tiffany.
Thanks again for the invite. How are you, Judd?
Good to see you. Thanks.
Great. I didn't know if you knew that Kathleen works with me, so that's how I
you got on.
Chimed in, which is great. But Colin, I loved what you just said about being compassionate enough to be able to deliver that message, but with enough distance. So the work I do, I'm in human resources. Mm-hmm. So when it comes to some difficult decisions and difficult matters that happen within organizations, I find that same, skill around being a 7, being able to keep that distance, but being able for people to feel the empathy and the compassion that I give to them, so that it's not, hopefully there's some comfort in some of that. I thought that was really great, a great way to share that. And the one thing, Jed, I thought was really interesting in your description, I never thought of myself as a glutton for anything, but you are correct. I mean, you look at my calendar, my friends have anxiety looking at it, you know, because every moment there's something else. And it's not the same thing. So I just love this conversation today because, again, I'm just now, it's been probably over, 10 years since I last had connected with looking at the Enneagram. So, so I'm really, really excited to just hear the discussions. But those are a few of my thoughts.
Great. Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks for joining in on that. Yeah. Laura, did you want to say anything? You don't need to, but I saw that you might identify as a 7.
Yeah, I'm 7 with an 8 wing, and I just had to chuckle because I'm a Presbyterian minister as well.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
Wow,
I may have to look at this career.
Tiffany, God has not called you yet to be a Presbyterian.
Perhaps.
That's so funny, Laura. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciated what you said about the headspace and Presbyterianism and our rich heritage of education as part of our tradition. So it does. I happen to have been born into that. So when it comes to genetic versus nurture, nature nurture thing, may just be the nurture part. But anyway, yeah, I don't have a whole lot more. I've just been exploring the Enneagram for a couple of years now, but I am an 8 wing, so it fits well with the times when I need to stand up for people and say that is wrong, and so that's been helpful in my ministry as well. I do find that in spiritual circles, when I'm doing spiritual formation or things like that, there is a kind of disrespect for 7s that I don't appreciate. So, Colin, I appreciate the way you lifted up the positive sides of being a 7, because I think that gets lost in a lot of the Enneagram work. We tend to focus only on the downsides of whatever our particular Enneagram place is. So thank you, Colin, for lifting up that positive side. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Good to have you on here. We'll have to see if we can get the Presbyterian Church to fund a research project on Enneagram and ministry. ENFPs, Myers-Briggs, which do fit as 7s and as 2s. Are you both ENFPs? Yeah. So that's the 7 Myers-Briggs often, and a lot of ENFPs are minister types. So. Yeah. How about some questions? Yeah, please, Colin, go ahead. Yeah.
Just a couple other pieces, which is one is I really do resonate with the 7s sometimes struggle with being alone. Absolutely, and I think at its best, it's not just escapism from pain, but there's just so much more life and energy in other people. The running joke is when our kids graduate and go to college, we're just going to run a kennel, right? We're going to have 50 dogs because there's got to be something to do and people and energy. But so that one is absolutely, and I pray in motion, right? I cannot do contemplative prayer. That is not possible for me. Thank you very much. And then the disintegration to 1, which is the judgment piece, is absolutely true. When here's a great idea, here's the energy, let's go. I've invested so much into this community, this concept, this idea. Hey, everybody, let's go. And then in true Presbyterian fashion, it goes to committee, right? Where it dies a slow atrophying death. Can result in this deep judgment or a presumption that people don't care as opposed to they are carefully considering. At my worst, I will go to the anger of you just don't care, which is usually not actually true, but it's how it's experienced when someone doesn't get on board quick and let's go. We don't need more time to think about this.
Yeah, thank you. Also, as a 7, find that the people I create with are like family. Creating with people is such a rush. that I really enjoy. I like working in groups and teams because there's an energy in that kind of, and they really become kind of soulmates. I don't have a soulmate. I have like 12 soulmates, people who I go deep with and get energy from. And so maybe that's why I'm divorced too. I don't know if that has played into that. But, so we have some questions. Jump in.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I actually have my same question because my other child is a 15-year-old daughter, and I'm quite certain she's a 7. And I'm a 4, so I don't have anywhere near the energy to keep up with a 15-year-old that's very busy all the time. I'm curious to know, same question, what, as a parent, what's a good way to parent? What should be things I should be thinking of? What would have been helpful to you as a teenager?
Anybody can jump in there.
Yeah, I have, my son is probably, if I had to guess, a 4, and my daughter, and he's 21. My daughter is 17, and she is probably a 7. So kind of similar to you, Julie. And I'd say for her, I mean, the constant interaction, keeping her busy, but also spending time with her yourself is going to be really important, is what I will say, at least from my experience. My son, he can be left alone and doing what he's doing, but then he comes back also, you know, and again, that's part of what you build as a family and part of what you build with them as a parent. And as they grow older and older, you know, I mean, she's going to be leaving next year as well. And I just feel like you need to solidify that right now as you're in their earlier teens, mid-teens, before they go off and what they're doing. But that's what I found so far.
Laura,
Yeah,
Colin?
To piggyback on that one, it's probably impossible to feed the insatiable need for connection and response, because that's just, you're a human being, so it probably can't be done. However, I would jump on the incredible value of being able to say, I have this time set aside for you and only you, and I want to hear everything that's going on in your mind. I want to celebrate what you got. I will not be on my phone or distracted. We're going to do this. I can't give you everything, but I can give you this. And this is all about you. So to allow for that celebration, right? And I'm just 100% attending, because I can say as a 7, when somebody's doing the, no, I really care what you're doing, honey. Yeah, no, it's really important. You know, no, you don't. No, you don't. It's received as disinterest in someone's passion. But to be able to say, I don't have all day, but I have this for you and I want to share it with you, can be a huge affirmational gift.
Mm. Yeah, thank you.
That's really meaningful to me for you all to say the spending time, because I often feel like I'm not capable of giving her the things she needs, but I can do that because time is my love language. And so that's super encouraging to me. Thank you.
Yeah, Linda.
Colin, I have a question.
Yeah.
You used the phrase "arranging for," and I wonder, what does that mean?
Sure. In my experience, I have my wife is a writer and a poet and a thinker and a feeler. She professionally is an E&L teacher for immigrant children, and she will almost automatically go internal. What does this feel like? How does it get turned into poetry and art, and a very strong interior world and response? And I am a strong 7, so it's a very strong exterior reaction and life. So when we're both pushed, she will retreat, I will advance, and then there's a lot of space in between, right? And she is wonderful in bringing me back to the earth on which we really live. right? And at my best, I hope that I am helpful in helping her rise up into the world in which we actually live. There's balancing forces at their best, and we're 23 years in, so it's going okay. But what I mean by that is very, very strongly move to emotion and interior response, and you can exit the room you're in. Just zoop. Now here's what I'm thinking and feeling, and you are not included at the moment.
Well said. Yeah, thank you. There's also a comment on from Facebook, is another 7 agreeing on time and attention for 7s to be able to give them. I think my love language is shared experience. Like, I just want to go from shared experience to shared experience. And an experience could be deep talking, like this right now is an experience, you know? But if that's how I always want to create experiences with people, really dramatic, deeply engaging, fun experiences. And that's how I give love, and that's how I receive love. Question, Ida?
Yes, I have a question, Jed, and thanks for teeing it up so beautifully. So my question is, do 7s have the innate ability to see themselves when they digress into a 1 by plugging into their studious 5 nature, observer nature, to work on themselves when they disintegrate into the 1? Or do they need outside influence or reminders from outside to see themselves disintegrating into that 1 space?
Yeah,
Does my question make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's what we basically mean by levels of health in the Enneagram, is the capacity to witness oneself rather than to be oneself. So I think that's a level of health, to watch yourself show up and realize the ramifications of that, and then to have some choice about whether or not I'm going to add that thing to my calendar or go out and try to get that, is related to our level of health. The monkey mind is another way which we describe 7s. They have a hard time with monkey mind, right? And so Buddhist practice or meditative practice is really hard for 7s, but it's important for 7s. Because then they can watch themselves, they can identify as the witness, which 5s have a natural ability to do. But I don't know, I think I married 1s and my mom was a 1, so I externalized my need for order. And that was part of the 7-1 dynamic is a very popular relationship dynamic, because 7s externalize their external parent, their parent imago, onto 1s. And 1s do that with everybody, right? 1s just want a parent and order everything. So it's a great relationship, except for nobody gets to be healthy, right? And so I have to take responsibility for my oneness to order myself. And 1s become 7s on vacation, right? So they can, and so the dynamic there is often a parent-child dynamic or an order-chaos dynamic. And if you're not careful, you'll polarize each other, what Colin was saying, you'll polarize each other, and then that makes a difficult relationship, when in reality, you have to internalize that instead of externalize it to be healthy. That may not have answered your question. And Colin, Sarah, you may have another response.
Well, just before Colin jumps in, let me put a little bit more clarity around the question. If 7s are so busy filling their space up with activity and engagement and connection all the time, and to Colin's point regarding contemplative prayer, at what point do you make space to actually sit in the discomfort and work through them? Is that innate, or is that built in, or is that just a matter of educating yourself about your personality so you can catch it when it does happen? I hope that brings clarity.
I would suggest, at least for me, it's anything but innate. It's called spiritual counseling, therapists, a really patient wife, and getting older. All of those things were necessary to no, it's not innate at all. It was a learned skill to seek to be more healthy. And with the contribution of all of those factors, it begins to come. But no, it's an absolute blind spot that requires others in other ways to help highlight for you, hopefully compassionately, and then with some ability to transform.
Well, you all, we're out of time. It's so interesting how Enneagram community time runs out quickly. So in closing, just a deep thanks to all of our panelists. Colin, thank you for, although this feels like it's much more fun than what you were going to do, so maybe we don't have to thank you as much.
Yeah, I should thank you. Yeah.
But it really was delightful, and especially all of you jumping in and sharing your stories. Again, the power, what's called the narrative tradition in the Enneagram, is listening to each other tell stories about ourselves and speak first person is really transformative and helpful. So I do want to say thank you to all of our panelists. And again, what a great group of people we've got on. The Enneagram community continues to build. So invite your friends to come and your partners so they can learn about themselves, and invite that person at work that you really struggle with to say, hey, you may want to come at 3 o'clock. It's a great way of learning about ourselves. Next week we will look at the 8, 9, and the 1, the gut triad. So if any of you all are in that triad, would love to have you in the panel. Feel free to reach out to me, and if you'd like to volunteer to be on that, would be great. And yeah, thanks so much for being a community of love and support. Again, the reason we do this is for self-understanding, but also to give grace and compassion to the other people in our lives, to realize why they show up the way they do, and so we can open our hearts and our minds always to practice grace and compassion for each other in all the beautiful ways in which we show up. Thank you all for being on today. Blessings. May you have a great, fabulous weekend. Peace.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Laura. Good to have you on.